Welcome to the Science of Sports Performance, where we discuss the real science of nutrition and exercise, helping you train smarter, fuel better, and perform at your very best. My name is Ben Pressler, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at Brigham Young University, majoring in both nutritional and exercise sciences. I'm pursuing my PhD with the goal of becoming a professor of sports nutrition. For everyone here, guys, welcome back. It's been a few months since I've uploaded an episode of the podcast. I could give you a whole host of reasons. For those who do watch on YouTube, you can tell that I'm in a different studio. My wife and I moved back to Utah. I don't need to get into the whole story, but my apologies for being so long since the last upload. You could almost connect it to that issue I've had. But today's episode, we're going to be talking about the disconnect between knowledge and action. Now, the reason for that, this is definitely a more sort of philosophical topic, definitely touching into the realms of psychology. You can definitely say it's not something that ties in directly with nutrition and exercise science, which are the things that I study, the things that I know enough about that I feel comfortable making a podcast. So at the start of this episode, I guess I want to acknowledge that this is not my field, but it is a concept that I have been trying my best to study a lot more about, trying to get some answers, just because it's something that I struggle with, right? So I really think that I kind of am a good example of sort of the disconnect between knowledge and action, especially as you get into areas. Obviously, for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to focus mostly on like our health and our fitness level. You know that there are these things that you need to do and should be doing to take care of your physical body. Why do some people struggle to do them? Now, in my shoes, obviously I study nutrition and exercise science at BYU. I want to get my PhD in these things. I have a podcast about these topics. It's an area that I love to study and read papers about. Like I look into this subject not even because classes make me, but just because it's something I enjoy. Like I really am fascinated by this topic. But obviously I think I'm strong. I'm successful in weightlifting. I've done powerlifting and things like that. And I do think I definitely have an above average level of health and fitness, but I'm really not particularly lean or fit. I don't have great cardiovascular endurance. And these are definitely goals that I have, ways that I hope to improve, but I struggle where the rubber meets the road. I know all about the physiology behind these things. I know what needs to happen in order for me to reach those goals, but I struggle really putting my knowledge into action. Sometimes actually I'll go to YouTube and I'll look up YouTube videos by bodybuilders or whoever about, I'm really looking for tips on how to cut down, how to lose body fat, how to make a successful cutting program so that I can lose body fat and get to a leaner level. And a lot of times I'll get into these YouTube videos and they'll be teaching you about what a calorie is, teaching you that you need to consume 500 calories less per day than you burn each day. And they teach you about your total daily energy expenditure and your exercise activity thermogenesis. And don't get me wrong at all. Those are concepts that are absolutely awesome for people to understand who are trying to lose weight, but I already understand them. I already know all those things. How come I know all of these things that these people are putting out on how to lose weight and how to cut? But then I struggle sometimes to really actually put that knowledge into action. In the same vein, I have this podcast. I really enjoy making episodes for this podcast. I want to grow this podcast and teach as many people as I possibly can. And I know that in order to grow a podcast, I need to be uploading episodes frequently and getting my message and my information out there to people. How come it's been months since last time I uploaded a podcast episode next? And I think probably most people listening to this in all walks of life have certain areas where they understand there are things that they need to be doing. They know they need to be doing it, but they just struggle. And so before we really get into the meat of this episode, I think it's obvious to all of you by this point that I am not coming at this subject from the topic of one who's an expert. I don't have it all figured out. I'm not perfect at this, But what I'm coming at it from is it's something I struggle with continually. I have struggled with it. I still do struggle with it. And I have been trying to learn more about the causes of it and what I can do to get over it. And in today's episode, I really just want to share some of the things that I've been studying with you guys. Now, as we get into it, I want to really just kind of show you the scope of this problem. Or a lot of people struggle with it. There's a study, it's called the intention behavior gap in physical activity. The difference, the gap between what you intend to do and what actually happens, what activities actually show up in your behavior. It's from 2023, and it was just a survey, but basically in the survey, they asked people about what their exercise intentions were, what their actions looked like, just these questionnaires. And basically, they were able to divide all of the people who took this questionnaire into 4 different groups. So the 4 groups, you have people who didn't intend to exercise and didn't exercise. So really, they successfully completed their intentions because they didn't want to exercise and they didn't. But obviously, that's hopefully none of you guys. Hopefully, all of you guys intend to. You do have a very, very small group in this study who didn't intend to exercise, but then ended up exercising anyways. But then probably the 2 who are going to show up in the audience of this episode a little more are the people who intended to exercise but didn't reach their goal of what they intended to do. And then people who intended to exercise and did meet their goal or exceeded their goal. The meat of this episode is going to be focusing on those people who intend to exercise but they didn't meet their intention goal. Well, this study found that 48% of people, so almost half people who intend to exercise don't meet the goal that they have for themselves. Lots and lots of people are like that. And I mean, obviously you could kind of go into a conversation of maybe setting more realistic goals and things. Like if your goal is to exercise 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, then that's a very lofty goal for yourself. You're going to fall into the category of people who didn't reach their intention goal just because you've set such a crazy goal. And frankly, there is going to be a spectrum on this, right? It's not necessarily a black and white, you did or you didn't meet your goal. Maybe some people got close. Maybe some people didn't get close. Maybe some people do a really, really, really good job some days or some weeks. And then other days and other weeks, maybe things pop up that just detract them from their goals. There's a spectrum, but as we go into the meat of this episode, try and think like where do you fall on that spectrum? How often do you meet your intention goal? What are the struggles and the obstacles that are keeping you from reaching those goals? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, obviously I see that there is some value in this topic, in this conversation that we can have. And so since it's something that I have experienced so much personally, it's something that I just want to share some of my reflections on based on actually quite a few sources, varying from some are definitely more reliable sources, psychological study, scientific. Others are from, experts, authors. Some of these, frankly, are purely anecdotal, but I really hope that you'll get a lot of value out of the things that I have to say. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about is why does this gap exist, the intention behavior gap? That's definitely not a phrase maybe that I would have come up with myself. I would call it the disconnect between knowledge and action, but it seems like in the psychological literature, and again, that's not a field that I am very familiar in, never even taken a psychology class, but that's what it seems to be called. It's the intention behavior gap. Why does this gap exist? Now, I am going to share some ideas from varying sources. The first one is the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. I think a lot of you have probably heard of that book, if not read that book. It's incredible. Really, I haven't finished it, but it's one that I have been reading in the past couple months, trying to get some better ideas for how I can improve in these areas. And one thing that I really, really liked that he discusses is that a habit, a behavior that we do repeatedly, is the intersection of 3 different things. It's like one of those triple Venn diagrams, and the habit is only going to be in the very, very center of that, where these 3 areas meet. The first is knowledge, the second is skill, and the third is desire. Now, the first step there is knowledge, and he actually says maybe a triple Venn diagram isn't perfect because these traits develop in that order. First is knowledge, second is skill, and third is desire. So what's the disconnect between knowledge and action? In a lot of cases, you could say it's the skill and the desire, right? For a habit to take place after your knowledge that you should do it, you need to be capable of doing it in the first place. And you need to want to. You need to have some sort of a motivation to get you to actually do it. Now, an example could be eating vegetables, right? I think a lot of us know that we should, but honestly, maybe you need to know why. Why should we eat vegetables? Well, if you don't know that vegetables have fiber and that they have vitamins and minerals and they help keep you full, they have a ton of health benefits. If you don't have that knowledge, you're probably not going to have any reason to eat them in the first place. Then you need to have the skill of eating vegetables. And maybe that's something that sounds pretty silly to say, but you need to know a good recipe of how to cook vegetables. You need to know what your favorite vegetables are. You could even take it maybe a step further and say, well, you need to be able to afford vegetables or have a garden where you can get vegetables. You need to have some method of getting the vegetables to eat them in the first place. And then, of course, you need to have the desire to eat them, which, we know that for vegetables can be a little tricky, but maybe you need to have the skill to cook them in a way that you like so that you have a desire. There's lots of different things that you can get to, but that's that first thing. And it's actually one that I'm probably going to touch back on in this episode, but just remember that a habit is the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. And knowledge, skill, and desire develop in that order. The next source that I'm going to pull from is the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. That is also a very popular book, one that I've read, one that perhaps some of you guys listening to have read as well. If you haven't, I'm going to recommend it. It's a great book. And he talks about, of course, habits is the whole subject of the book, but he talks about habits as basically our way of solving problems. Now, you might understand what he means by that, maybe not, but it's basically like if you experience stress at work or in your home life or whatever, you're experiencing some kind of a stress, you have developed some sort of a habit to cope with that stress. Now, you might not think that you have, but you have. Maybe that habit is to binge watch TV shows. Maybe it's to smoke. Maybe it's to take a nap. Or maybe you have a very healthy habit that you probably have had to be very intentional about creating to deal with that stress in a healthy way. Relaxing, reading, maybe some form of meditation. But basically, we have habits in responses to all these different things that we experience in life. And sometimes they're bad habits. Hopefully they're good habits, but usually, we can just pick them up from the way we grew up. We can grow those habits. Now, that's not to say that we should be blaming our habits or anything on external factors, because that's just going to make it so that you never take up the responsibility to actually fix them and make your life better. But we pick up habits. We see other people do habits, our parents, our friends, or whoever, and we create these habits as a method of solving problems. Now, as a method of helping us to form new habits, he teaches us that habits that we hope to create need to be first noticeable, second attractive, 3 easy, and 4 rewarding. Conversely then, if we have a bad habit that we're trying to break, rather than making it noticeable, we should try to make it invisible. Rather than making it attractive, we should try to make it unattractive. Rather than making it easy, we should try to make it hard. And rather than making it rewarding, we should try and make it dissatisfying. The results of it are something that we don't like. Now, our brains fight against us, right? So despite the knowledge that we have, there could be too much friction to actually put these habits into our daily lives because maybe, frankly, we don't notice them, right? Our habits are not recognizable. Maybe there's just so much friction. There's so many steps involved in the environment that we live in currently to actually make a habit happen that it just never ends up happening. And then if we do a good habit, sometimes maybe we don't remember why it's good for us. Maybe we don't get a result out of it that would encourage us to do it again in the future. So for an example I could give you is maybe doing cardio. You want to do more cardio to get healthy, maybe lose a little bit of weight, and you decide that you're going to run, but you just can't seem to start that good habit, right? Well, frankly, when you wake up in the morning, your brain is tired. You don't really know, you kind of have that brain fog in the morning until you kind of get up and moving. And so in the beginning parts of the day, when you plan to go run, your brain could honestly just be trying to focus on so many other things other than running that it just completely slips your mind, genuinely. So what are some things that we could do to make your habit a little bit more noticeable? Well, you could put your running shoes by the front door or right next to your bed. I think in his book, he actually mentioned somebody who sleeps in the clothes that they're going to run in the morning. So they wake up and they're already dressed, their pajamas or their running clothes. So they don't have to think about that in the morning. They are able to very quickly notice, even just when they look in the mirror, that it's the morning and it's time to run. Well, the other thing you could do is to make running and doing your morning cardio more attractive, right? Sometimes you notice those running shoes, you know that you're supposed to, but you're really struggling with that desire piece. It doesn't sound very attractive. Well, some things that you can do, maybe to influence yourself to do a little more cardio and go on runs, is you could run in a park or somewhere that you think is really pretty, someplace that you enjoy spending time. Another thing that I think is a really, really good idea, whether it's for cardio or going to the gym or really any good habit, is to try to get a friend involved. Well, that could be a very attractive thing to do. Maybe with a spouse or a partner, you're going to go on a run with them. Great way to spend time with them, or just a good friend of yours. But on the flip side of that, if you have a friend that you go running with every morning, not only does it make the run more attractive, but it actually makes missing the run more unattractive, because you have to confront your friend who's probably already woken up and got their shoes on. Then you have to text them and tell them that you're not going on that run that morning. You're kind of leaving them hanging. So it actually makes missing the run unattractive. At the same time, it makes going on the run more attractive. Well, the next thing you need to do is make your habit easy. In the case of cardio, honestly, the best thing you can think of to do, I can think of maybe, I hope you guys are a little more creative than me, but frankly, just kind of meet yourself where you're at in the example of cardio, right? So like if you're sore and you're achy, it's okay if you need to take a step back, and rather than run 4 or 5 miles at a really fast pace, you go on a little jog, because then you're still in the habit of going on that run every day, but you're just meeting yourself where it's at. You don't need to kill yourself every single day, but if you're trying to form a habit, the thing that's going to help that habit stick and grow is the repetition of it. So don't miss a day just because, it's too hard, because you're too sore or whatever. You can have very, very valuable reasons for why you're sore or tired, or maybe you even have an injury. But if you just get in the habit of showing up and doing something, even if it's very easy at times when it needs to be, that's what's going to help that habit stick. And the last thing, you need to make your morning cardio rewarding. In that case, you could reward yourself. Obviously, maybe you shouldn't reward yourself for going on a run with donuts for breakfast, right? But you can think of some sort of a reward that you can give to yourself. Maybe it's a little bit of free time to watch a show or things like that. You kind of get a habit that you maybe should be spending less time doing, but something you want to do, but don't have the justification watching TV or something like that, with a habit that you hope to do and need to do more of. You can stack those habits together. This is an idea from James Clear called habit stacking, and just make it a little more enjoyable in that way. I've done that too. I will watch like a favorite TV show while I'm on the treadmill or the Stairmaster at the gym, and then that just makes it all that more desirable and rewarding, because you get to move along in the plot and things as you're doing your cardio. I think it's a great idea and a great way to do it. And then, of course, sometimes there are examples where the habit itself is rewarding. If you stick to the habit of a diet, honestly, you're going to see that weight drop on the scale. You're going to see physical changes in your body, and a lot of times just actually performing the habit day to day is rewarding in and of itself. Now, the last source I wanted to pull from about why the intention behavior gap exists, why there's a disconnect between knowledge and action, is ChatGPT. Now, some of you maybe don't have a problem with that. If you do, real quick, I want to tell a story that really helped frame ChatGPT for me in my own mind. I had a writing professor at college who told us this. And she said that she likes to think of ChatGPT as just a buddy, just like a friend. And so if you are messaging ChatGPT, imagine it the same as texting a friend. And so maybe the sources are not going to be totally accurate. Maybe it's not totally trustworthy. It's not omnipotent and all-knowing, right? Because it's just a friend. But ChatGPT does have the ability to kind of just give you feedback on some of your own ideas or produce some thoughts of their own self. So obviously, taking this with a grain of salt, maybe even a big grain of salt, I asked ChatGPT to, speak sort of philosophically, give some general ideas about, this question I was going to ask it. But I asked it about this disconnect between knowledge and action. I even described my own situation. I study nutrition and exercise science, and even still, with all this knowledge that I have, sometimes I struggle connecting what I know I should do to what I actually do. And it came back with quite a few ideas. I wanted to share my favorite ones with you. First off, it said that knowledge is stored outside of the action-taking part of the brain, right? So there's obviously all these different parts of the brain, and I don't know neurobiology that well. These are questions I'd love to ask Andrew Huberman about one day, but knowledge, the part of your brain that stores the knowledge, the things that I'm learning in my classes and in my readings of these papers and these textbooks, it's stored in a different part of the brain than the part of the brain that commands the actions we're going to take in each moment. And so for that reason, sometimes it can be hard to get those two parts of the brain to align and act the way that you know you're supposed to act. Now, the next thing it said is that this definitely is a little more philosophical, a little less scientific, but it says that your brain is a negotiation between parts and priorities. Now, for example, your brain might have an emotional part, an emotional center. It could have a reward-driven center. It can have this part of your brain that is thinking out to the future, so it's kind of your future self bringing into the equation. But then you also have your present self. You do have the knowledgeable part of your brain, but you have all these different parts of your brain that are working together to make the same decisions. So as much as we would all sometimes love to just give the steering wheel over to the part of our brain that keeps the future self in mind, because we know that we would just have the healthiest habits and we would delay gratification, it would be great. That's just not how it works. And so as much as the part of your brain that does keep your future self in mind wants to have an input into this conversation of what you're going to do, so does the emotional center of your brain that's tired and stressed after a long day of work. So does the part of your brain that just wants to be as efficient as possible, right? Doesn't want to maybe cook a healthy meal when there's already something ready in the fridge that maybe isn't quite as healthy, but when that part, the convenient part of your brain and the emotional part of your brain get together, they have a really strong argument for the actions that you should take. Of course, again, that's not super scientific, but I think we can all kind of understand that principle that I'm talking about. We kind of have to get all these different centers of the brain to align. And that's definitely a lot more often easier said than done. The next thing, the third thing that I really like from ChatGPT is that we respond to cues. And this is actually something that James Clear talks about a lot in Atomic Habits. Not saying that James Clear used ChatGPT to write Atomic Habits, but basically all around us in our environment, in our homes, in our workplaces, there are cues and there are triggers that our brains are going to act in response to, right? We don't just live in a bubble, but we have other people living around us, living their own lives, and we have just all these cues in our environments around us. So, for example, we respond to what's in the fridge right now. What is your social circle doing? Your friends, your spouse, what are their habits? You're much more likely to mimic those behaviors, as well as, what are your emotions after work today? Are you stressed? Are you tired? Has it just been a bad day? Are you going through something maybe really challenging, like a loss of a job or a loved one? Those can definitely be huge influences that are going to affect your behavior. So as much as it might be easier to live in a bubble without these cues, that's just not the world that we live in. And so we have to learn how to live in these environments that have all of these different cues around us. Now, definitely there are ways that we can manipulate the environment around us. We can try and manage some of those cues so that they are helping us rather than hindering us. But no matter which way you put it, they exist, and we have to be aware of that. And then the last thing I wanted to share from ChatGPT is that we are oftentimes fighting invisible forces. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, maybe you have a bad habit as a coping mechanism, right? Our habits are things that we have created, these patterns of behavior to solve problems. And again, even if you don't really recognize what the problem you're trying to solve by eating a bunch of chocolate chip cookies or smoking cigarettes, a lot of times there is something. And so if you don't recognize that your bad habit could actually be a solution to a problem, some sort of a coping mechanism, then you're going to have a lot harder of a time trying to stop that bad habit till you identify what the cause of it is. So if you have a bad habit that is a coping mechanism, you can't just get rid of that bad habit, but you need to replace it, right? There's going to be a hole if you just cut that bad habit out. You need to put something good in its place. Otherwise, with that empty hole, you're just going to revert back to that bad habit. Also, maybe sometimes you have old habits because of the way you grew up, like I mentioned earlier. Your parents or your friends when you were younger, it's the people that you were around when you were in that very influential stage. You're going to pick up the habits that they had just because that's what you do. That's how you learn. You're going to do the things that the people you look up to do as well. And sometimes those are bad habits that you pick up. Now, again, I want to be very, very clear that is not your free ticket to make excuses and blame your behavior on others. We need to take ownership of those things. But until you understand that you're fighting maybe that invisible force, you're going to have a really, really tough time. So basically, you need to identify if there are any invisible forces and backtrack them so that you can actually figure out how you're going to overcome them. One more example of an invisible fear that ChatGPT came up with is like fear, a sort of fear. Think about, I think budgeting is probably a good example. Maybe you're in a bad economic situation, you're in some debt that you hope to get out of, and you really struggle with budgeting. Maybe you know that you should be taking a look at how much debt you have and how much money you have in your bank and how fast you can pay it off. But frankly, deep down that your situation is worse off than you wish it was. And so that just taking a look at your finances in that regard is not going to be very fun. It's going to be a little scary. You'd rather live in ignorance than have a good knowledge of the bad situation that you're in. And then one last note from ChatGPT is you have to understand that knowledge is very safe and comfortable and easy. It's easy to sit around and collect a ton of knowledge about a topic, whereas action is very difficult and it's very messy, right? No matter how much knowledge you collect, it doesn't change the reality of the action, right? And so if an action is going to be hard, sometimes we like to postpone it and wait and think, well, I just need to collect a little bit more knowledge about this. And again, knowledge is really important, right? In order to get a habit, you have to have the knowledge to do it, but you also have to have the skill and the desire, right? And sometimes a lack of desire comes from knowing that an action is hard. And sometimes a lack of skill comes from the fact that you don't have any experience with the action. And so if there is an action that you are trying to get put into place, you just have to try. You just have to get started. And it's messy and it's hard and it can definitely be scary and daunting. But that is another reason for that disconnect between knowledge and action, is just that they're very different experiences. And so until we're able to bear that discomfort of action and making mistakes, our knowledge is never going to serve us in creating new habits. And that idea is actually a pretty good segue into the next portion of this episode. First off, as we segue into, what to do about this disconnect between our knowledge and our action, well, there's a study, another one that I wanted to share with you guys. It's called Closing the Intention Behavior Gap. So it definitely cites pretty heavily on the study that I mentioned earlier about the attention behavior gap in physical activity. And this study is basically seeking to answer, why does it exist and what can we do about it? What are the differences that we see in individual people that makes one person more likely to exceed or meet their expectations than another? And so basically what they did is they took a group of subjects and they gave them a series of tests and questionnaires to try and gauge their likelihood of engaging in challenging behavior. Now, that is a very, very important thing to understand. They weren't asking them about what their likelihood is of engaging in physical activity or in meeting their exercise goal, but they wanted to gauge the subject's likelihood of just engaging in challenging behavior. What is their aptitude for doing things that are going to be hard? And then comparing that to, like in the first study, that describes the attention behavior gap, how many people don't meet their goals. They wanted to see if they could compare those different groups of people meeting or not meeting and intending or not intending to exercise. They wanted to compare that to the aptitude for doing challenging things. And I think that you probably would not be surprised to hear that they found a very, very significant correlation between people who are likely to do hard things and people who are likely to meet their intention goals in physical activity. Now, once again, I'd like to point out that this is a psychology study. That's not an area that I'm very familiar with, and there is a good chance that I could be not perfectly understanding the intent that these authors had. But back to that finding, the people who are more likely to perform challenging activities are more likely to close that intention and behavior gap. So why is that? I mean, I don't think that's probably going to be very surprising to many of us, but what does that teach us? What does that mean that we can do to help close that intention behavior gap, to help reconnect our knowledge and our action? Well, first off, I think it teaches us that we need to view exercise as being hard. We need to view our goals as being hard. We need to view these worthwhile things, these good habits that we want to put into place, as being hard. Now, one example that I could share about that is that as I, in the past, was trying to do better at cardio and going on runs, I would go on a run and I'd be feeling, okay in the first maybe mile or two. And then when you got to about mile 2 or 3, it would start to become very, very hard. And in my head, that meant that I had achieved my goal, right? The goal was to do a hard thing, and I achieved that goal. At mile 3, it became hard, so my run was done. And that is just not the way that we need to think about it. If doing something hard is the end goal, it's what signals the end of an activity, then in that case, we are always going to be selling ourselves short of what we could have actually accomplished. Whereas if doing something hard is the activity that you're going to engage in, if you're going to go on a run and the entire run is going to be hard, then when you get to a point where it is hard, well, then that's good. It means you're doing the thing that you hope to do, and you can continue on and push on. Now, I think one thing that we can do to improve our capability of engaging in those hard things, because it definitely is not very desirable, it's not very attractive activity for people to engage in. What if you are in that group that does not have the aptitude for engaging in hard things? Like, what can you do? Well, in this case, I actually really liked reading the book Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. A lot of you are probably very familiar with David Goggins. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's an ultramarathon runner. And he is just all about discipline and doing hard things, even though they're hard. And I think a lot of us, myself included, there was a point in my life where I had seen about David Goggins, and I definitely understood that there were traits that he had that I needed to probably work on developing, being a little more disciplined and a little more harder working. But there's definitely this part of you that kind of assumes that he was just born a different breed than the rest of us. And that's another book. This episode is actually secretly just me recommending all my favorite books to you guys. But in the span of me reading that book, I learned a lot about his early life and the challenges that he went through. He actually, after he graduated high school, enlisted in the United States Air Force. And he had the plans of being a paratrooper until he failed out of the paratrooper class. It was too hard for him, and he quit. And he went on to be, I think, an air traffic controller or something like that for the rest of his term. And then after he got out of the Air Force, I think he became a pest control. He worked for a pest control company. He was an exterminator, setting traps for cockroaches and rats. And he actually got up to 300 pounds before he decided that he was going to become a Navy SEAL. That was a goal. He always kind of maybe felt guilty about dropping out of the paratrooper training in the Air Force. And he just decided that he needed to fulfill that part of his potential. He could see it in himself, and he needed to do that. And he completely changed his life. He lost a ton of weight in order to even be able to get into the Navy SEALs, and he met the right people who believed in him, and he obviously has eventually gotten to the point where he is now. He's incredibly successful and incredibly disciplined. And that, more than anything, was very powerful understanding for me that Guys like him are not just born a different breed, but that potential is in us. And what can we do to kind of realize it? Well, this is the point that I'm trying to make. Sometimes you need to have someone or something calling you to do those hard things. Obviously, for some people, that someone or something calling you to do those hard things, maybe you're in the military and that's your drill sergeant in boot camp or whatever. I mean, that's kind of what the military is famous for, right? Is, the discipline and the yelling instructors who are having, the soldiers do these very, very hard things, push-ups after push-ups and running miles upon miles, doing these hard things. And I feel very safe to say that as hard as those events are for those people, it is probably pretty transformative for them. They realize that they're capable of more than they thought they were in the past, and that helps increase their affinity to do those hard things. That's why I think, those people who are in the military for so long, they made a career out of it. Now they're in their 40s, their 50s. They still just have that ingrained in them. They didn't get out of the military and then just decide that they were done with that way of life, but they learned so much about themselves in those hard and stressful situations that it just becomes part of their personality from that point on. Now, for many of us, the solution to losing that weight or becoming more successful, studying harder, is not to enlist in the military, right? I totally understand that. But what are some things that we can do to get put in a situation where we need to do a little more? We need someone to push us. Honestly, go take a fitness class at your gym. I can guarantee you, when you have that instructor or that coach there, anyone who did a sport, maybe in high school or college knows this too. When you have your coach making you run on each interval, only taking so much rest time, push to the end of the workout, even when you don't. We as humans, there's a part of our brain, I swear, and again, barring science for just a second, there's a part of our brain that is just self-protective, as it should be. It doesn't want us to engage in these hard things when there's danger and threat involved. And so we're never going to be able to push ourselves to that same level of effort. We need someone or something else in place to get us there. And I think for a lot of us, it can be just taking a class, getting a coach. I am not going to be able to tell you perfectly for your own situation what that thing needs to be, but I'm pretty sure that there's going to be one, and you need to find it, look for it, and then that is going to help you with that affinity to doing hard things. My next idea on how to close that knowledge and action disconnect, how to close the intention behavior gap, is very similar to that last one about putting yourself in a situation where you have to, is to follow the story, whether it's reading a book or maybe just watch their YouTube or follow them on Instagram. It could be something as simple as that, but follow the story of someone who's done it first, right? Our brains are never going to want us to perform something that it thinks is impossible, right? We don't want to kick against the pricks and do something that's just going to be a waste of resources and effort. And so if there's this goal that we have and we're convinced that it might actually be impossible and that the efforts that we're going to put into this goal are not going to go anywhere, our brain's never going to be motivated to do it. So whatever that goal is, whether it's being successful in business or being a good communicator or having a good family life or relationship with your spouse, any of these goals, any of these areas where there's a disconnect between that knowledge and that action, follow somebody who did it first. Read their book, watch their YouTube, follow them on Instagram. Maybe it's somebody you know, maybe it's a friend or a family member. I think that would be a great case too, because then you can talk to them about it. You can get support. You can get advice. And that is going to help your brain overcome that fear that it holds about a waste of energy or effort or resources. And that's going to help you be more successful as well. The next thought that I have, actually, we're going to go back to some of those sources about why that knowledge behavior gap exists in the first place and see how we can remedy those reasons. And so going back to The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, again, he said that knowledge comes before skill, comes before desire, comes before a successful habit. We need those three things in that order to create a habit. Now, I think a lot of us probably struggle with the desire portion. Now, frankly, I don't have a great answer of how you can increase your desire when it's not there. In that moment when you don't have the desire to exercise and you know that you should, but the desire's not there, I don't have a great answer. But here's what I can tell you. Here's my ideas. is first off, if we know that the habit is not going to occur until we have knowledge and then skill and then desire, the first thing that we need to do is to become as knowledgeable as possible. That way, the skill and the desire have a foundation to stand on. If you just have like this little tiny bit of knowledge, that can be good. I'm not discounting that. But the skill and the desire need to build off that knowledge. And so for them to have the greatest chance to be able to do that, become as knowledgeable as possible. What's the next step then? You can probably guess, but you need to become as skilled as possible. After you're as knowledgeable as possible, you need to become as skilled as possible. And if you're not as skilled as possible, if the desire doesn't have that second foundation to stand on, well then it doesn't matter if you have it or not, but you need to be prepared for the situations where the desire is there and when you can motivate yourself and do the hard thing, maybe even when you don't want to. And you need to get ready for that situation by becoming as knowledgeable and as skillful as possible. The next is to create a net positive environment. Now, that is, again, going back to cues. ChatGPT talked about that. James Clear talks about in Atomic Habits. All the invisible forces that we can be fighting against, right? We need to create an environment to the best of our ability that is going to help us rather than hinder us in our goals. And that is actually something that I want to double down on, is creating a better environment to reach your goals is not just about cutting out the friction points, but it's about increasing the motivation, increasing your social circle with people who are succeeding in the areas that you hope to. If you want to be more successful in business, surround your people who are successful in business. Do the things that they're doing. Rather than just cutting out the bad, you need to increase the good too. And to really hammer this down, because I do think it's so important, I wanted to give you an example, and it's this. Why do golf balls have dimples on them? All the little holes on a golf ball, we all know what a golf ball looks like. What's the purpose of that, right? If the goal of a golf ball on a drive or whatever, you want to hit it as far and as accurately as you can, wouldn't we want it to be, like in most sports and cycling and even like speed skating and race car driving, we want to be as aerodynamic as possible, and that's going to help us with our speed, with our fuel efficiency. Wouldn't a golf ball being completely smooth, like a ping pong ball, help it be more aerodynamic, help it go faster, help it go further, help the energy of the golfer's swing count for more? So why does a golf ball have dimples? Well, the answer is to increase its drag, to reduce its aerodynamics. But why? Why would we want that for a golf ball? The reason for that is because golfers hit a golf ball on the bottom of the ball. Obviously, that's going to give it vertical lift, but it's also going to give it a backspin. Now, without going into maybe too much of physics for people, there's something called the Bernoulli principle, which is something we might have learned about, hopefully maybe in high school or something, but is basically when air is fast moving, it is low pressure, and when air is slow moving, it is higher pressure. Because of those dimples on the golf ball and the backspin, the drag force created by those dimples on the ball is actually fighting against the air on the bottom of the golf ball, slowing it down. And then the dimples are actually helping the air on the top of the golf ball go even faster, right? That because there's that friction working in the right way, you slow down the air on the bottom, you speed up the air on the top. And because of that, Bernoulli's principle, this whole principle about the way that these golf balls and things react in this way is actually called the Magnus effect. But basically you have the slow, meaning high pressure air on bottom, and the fast, low pressure air on top. This is the same way that airplane wings work. You actually create lift on the golf ball, meaning that because we've introduced the friction to the golf ball, but it's working with us rather than against us, it is actually adding even more vertical lift and even more flight time onto that golf ball, meaning because the golf balls have dimples, because they have those points of friction, the golf balls are able to go even further than if they were these smooth aerodynamic structures, just like a ping pong ball was. And so that is the power that our environment can have on us. Obviously, if the golf ball was to have topspin, it would be very, very bad. And in that case, if all we could do, we couldn't control the topspin, then a golf ball would go further without the dimples on it. But if we're able to create that backspin, that positive environment that's going to help us, then we are going to be very, very successful. We're going to get that extra lift that we need. The next idea I have for you guys is that sometimes you just have to do something. You just have to act. And I know I've kind of already hit on this back when we, talked about that. Knowledge is clean, action is messy. Knowledge is safe, action is dangerous and hard. But it's the truth. We just need to do something. And I am actually maybe I should say a terrible example of this, but I am a good, bad example of this. Sometimes I'll have a free hour, a whole hour in the morning before I need to be ready to go to class or anything in the morning. I have a full hour, and I know that maybe I should go on a run during that time, get some exercise in. Now, I don't run for an hour. I'm not in that good of a shape, but I would run for 20 or 30 minutes, and I have an hour. So isn't that plenty of time? But sometimes I won't, just because I know that it's going to take me 5 to 10 minutes to get dressed and get my shoes on. And after I get back, I'm going to want to shower before I go to class, and that could take 20 minutes. And so then I'm really pushing that hour. And so I don't want to go. I decide not to go. And I hope that I'm not just like making myself look really bad. Maybe some of you guys can relate to that. But if not, well, there you have it. I want to share maybe my failures to help you guys be a little more successful in your future. But that is just, action is messy, right? We know that we don't want our morning to get messy. We don't want to be late for class. And so we decide not to do those things. But you just got to do something, right? If you're at that point where you just know that maybe you're going to be pushing that hour if you go on that run before class, then just run for 10 minutes. Don't run for 20 or 30. Just run for 10. Just do something. And it might seem silly to take, 40 minutes of getting ready and getting cleaned up to go to class, to go on a 10-minute run. But again, you just need to be in the mindset of doing something, doing anything. And then with that foundation, you're going to be able to improve what you do when you do it. But if you're not in the habit of acting, if you're not in the habit of just doing something poorly, you're never going to be able to get in the habit of doing something well. All right. So if the option is do something poorly or do something not at all, do it poorly. All right. Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Next, I wanted to touch back on some of the psychological issues that we face. These are the things that ChatGPT told me about that I liked and shared with you earlier. But how can we resolve those issues? Remember, I asked ChatGPT, why does this disconnect between knowledge and action exist? Well, so now we're going to talk about how we can resolve that disconnect based on those ideas that it told us. So the first thing, as a reminder, it says that knowledge is stored away from the decision maker. Well, so first off, to solve that, I think we need to identify the shortcuts that the decision-making part of our brain likes to make. All right. So again, for the example of maybe healthy eating, why does the part of your brain that is making those decisions make a different decision than the knowledge part of your brain would want it to? Right? If you know you're supposed to eat healthy, but the action part of your brain doesn't, is it because it prefers convenience? Is it because it prefers taste? Right? What is it? If it's convenience, then you need to solve the convenience issue. You need to meal prep better, keep more healthy food and healthy snacks, fruits and vegetables around the house. So that way the action part of the brain has an easier time making a convenient decision. Those are definitely, obviously, sometimes people are going to have different struggles than others, but all of us, I feel safe to say, have moments of discipline and motivation and willpower. And in those moments of motivation and discipline and willpower, that's when we can make those beneficial decisions. That's when we can do the meal prep. Those things are going to permeate into the later moments. And so identify why the action part of your brain is making that shortcut. Identify the shortcut. Because for each of us, it's going to be different, but you have to identify it before you can fix it. The second thing it shared with us is that your brain is a negotiation between parts. So the thing that I think we can do to make that conversation go a little better inside of our brain, hopefully align each parts of our brain with the goals that we have, is to understand what each part of your brain stands to gain. Now, maybe you could take that one step back and say, well, what part of your brain is most likely to have a bad influence on your decisions? Is it the emotional part? Is it the rewards based part? Is it the selfish part? What is it? Identify that part and then identify what it stands to gain, right? Is there any way that your emotional, stressed out part of your brain that's tired at the end of work is going to benefit from going on a run even though it doesn't want to? We know that it could, right? Try and identify the way that you feel when you get some blood pumping, you get a little bit of exercise. We know that exercise is going to release endorphins in our brain and hopefully boost our mood a little bit. I think that in those good habits, it's not that it's just going to be a sacrifice of certain parts of our brain, but I think it's going to be a net positive for all those parts. So whatever that habit is you're trying to grow, whatever that part of your brain is that blocks you from doing it most of the time, identify what that part of your brain stands to benefit from you completing successfully this good habit. The third thing is that we respond to cues. Now, this is one that we've kind of discussed in a big way already. Improve your environment, cut out that friction, but also increase those motivators in your environment. Those things are going to create that positive lift on that golf ball to help it go even further. So understand that we respond to cues, identify your environment, identify what those cues are, both in your home life, in your work life, in your school life, whatever that is. All those different cues that you encounter, identify them as good or bad and increase those good ones as much as you can and decrease those bad ones as much as you can. But then lastly is, we're fighting these invisible forces, right? So again, examples, your childhood, the way that you grew up, the stresses that you face day to day, maybe some of the fears that you have, those invisible forces that are keeping you from successfully engaging in these good behaviors that you hope to. And the first step then is to identify what the invisible forces are that you're fighting even in the first place. The next step, it's going to sound simple, but I know it can actually be very difficult for many people, and that is to take ownership. You need to take ownership of the invisible forces that you're fighting. It has to be your fault. It can't be somebody else's fault, or else nothing is ever going to happen. Now, that might sound like it just makes total sense. I hope it does. But for a lot of people, that is actually the biggest part, right? A lot of people, I think, would rather be in a situation where they have no power to improve their lives because it's not their fault, because they have an excuse. They have a good, perfectly sound and backed reason for why they can't. It's very comfortable to people to be there. And we just need to get out of that. It needs to be your fault. You need to have the power to make positive changes into your life. In Stephen R. Covey's book, 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, there's a quote that I really, really love. It's really stuck with me. And he says, "Until a person has the power to say deeply and honestly, I am who I am today because of the decisions I made yesterday, that person will never have the ability to say, I choose otherwise." Now, I understand that is a scary idea for many people, to take ownership for the things that are going wrong and be proactive about fixing them. But if you're never going to take that ownership, then you're stuck. And being unstuck can be hard because it means that the only one keeping you from moving forward is yourself. But that's just what needs to happen. Identify those forces and you need to take ownership of them. And I think in a big way, you need to disconnect from those invisible forces, especially if it's maybe you have these habits you picked up, eating habits from your childhood, because that's how your parents did it. That's how you grew up. You understood that you eat a certain way when you're stressed or when you're tired or at the end of the night, just in all these different scenarios. You need to acknowledge that, but you need to take responsibility for it and disconnect from it. You need to say, I understand that is the way I grew up, but I am going to choose else. I'm going to choose a different path than that. That doesn't need to be the way that I live my life right now. And again, hopefully for some of you guys, I'm not trying to speak too philosophically or psychologically, offer those kinds of counsel because it's not my area of expertise. But these are things that have really stuck out to me and helped me in my understanding of this disconnect between knowledge and action. And I hope that it will do the same for you. Now, my last couple notes for this episode is, first of all, we should know that we are better at taking action than taking inaction, okay? It kind of goes back to saying, if you have a bad habit, you can't just cut it out because then it's going to come right back. You need to replace it. And so if your goal is to not do something, we can actually be really bad at that. Like that's my goal, right? Is to not eat a bunch of junk food, but our brains like to take action. They like to make decisions. And so trying to make a goal of not acting can be very, very challenging for our brains. What we need to do is set goals around action. Now, I can tell you that's something feel very good at. I'm very good at actively eating lots of fruits and vegetables and lean proteins and going to the gym and exercise. And I'm good at making those actions, making those choices. I'm bad at making the inactivity actions. Now, again, I'm sure that's a spectrum too. And so you need to figure out where you are in that and what you struggle most with. But if you are a person who is trying to have a goal of inaction, now you can have a goal of inaction. You can have a bad habit you're trying to cut out, but just understand that the best way to cut that out is to replace it with a piece of action, right? Especially if you're not eating very healthy at all. You're eating ramen noodles for lunch and Hot Pockets for dinner and pizza and those sorts of things, then just make a goal rather than saying, I'm not going to eat any ramen or pizza. Well, then what are you going to eat, right? You don't have a goal, you don't have a plan, and so you're going to end up eating ramen and pizza again. Just make a goal that you're going to eat a serving of fruits and vegetables each day. You're going to make a goal to eat a serving of lean protein at each meal. And eventually, as you increase those actions that you're taking and increasing those positive habits, they're going to push away some of those bad habits because there's not room for them. And then lastly, very lastly in this episode, the thing that I really would like you to take away is I just want you to know that you're not broken, right? If you feel like you have that disconnect between knowledge and action, know that you're actually pretty normal, right? I struggle with it. I study nutrition and exercise science, and I struggle with it in the realm of nutrition and exercise science. I struggle with it in my podcast. I don't create episodes and publish them as often as I know that I need to. You are not broken. You're normal. Now, that is a good thing to know because if you're just broken, there's no reason for you to try not to be. But again, it can be a scary thought to know that you have the power to do those good things for yourself because it means if you don't do them, it's nobody's fault but your own. I know that that's scary. I know that it can be daunting and challenging, but that's what needs to happen. So again, final takeaway, until you can say, I am who I am today because of the decisions I made yesterday, you never have the power to say, I choose otherwise. So admit that to yourself and choose otherwise. I hope that these topics and ideas have been helpful for you. They've been helpful for me. Again, if you'd like to read some of the books that I've read and kind of studying these areas, Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, Atomic Habits by James Clear have all been super, super helpful to me. I'd encourage you to take a look at those if you maybe want a little bit more information on these topics. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope this helps, and I'll see you in the next episode.